People who are learning a language often ask me the same questions. I can understand what I hear, but I can't speak. Why is that? When I'm standing in front of a native speaker, I suddenly freeze and can't say anything. If you click on this video, you might be one of those people. And of course, I'm a native Japanese speaker, so I've never had the experience of not being able to speak Japanese, but I've learned Korean and English to a level that I can communicate, and now I teach Japanese to people who are learning it. I also study German as a hobby simply because I love learning languages. So in this video, I want to talk about why speaking is so difficult even when you're studying hard. I'll share ideas from 2 Japanese best-selling books, Input to Taizen and Output to Taizen. And I also want to talk about what I've learned from my own experience as a language learner and teacher. I'm going to explain 3 main reasons, and for each reason, I'll share exact solutions and explain what you can do to actually start speaking. So you're not just learning why, you're learning how. And I've also put timestamps down below so you can skip ahead to each of the section if you feel like it. Let's get started. One thing is very clear. If you can't speak, it's because you're not practicing speaking enough. I think everyone knows this because this is quite obvious. If you've never spoken before, then there's no reason to expect that you suddenly be able to speak well. No matter how talented someone may be, I've never heard of anyone who spoke perfectly the very first time they tried. Now some of you may be thinking, no, I'm confident, I do produce a lot of output. I speak with Japanese people or native speakers every day, but I don't feel fluent. If that's you, then that falls under reason number 3, so you're very welcome to skip main 1 and main 2 and go straight to main 3. So the question is, why does this lack of output happen to you in the first place? There are 2 main reasons, and let me begin with the first one. The first reason is your personality when speaking that language. If you become a perfectionist or feel shy when speaking that language, the amount of output you produce naturally drops, often quite significantly compared to someone who doesn't feel that way. And just be clear, being a perfectionist or a shy person isn't a bad thing at all. It simply affects how much you're willing to speak in the early stages. Personally, I think this applies to many Japanese learners in particular. In fact, this is the number 1 reason I struggle with output. I'm quite a perfectionist, so I often find myself thinking, oh, I don't want to make a mistake. And that thought always appears the moment I try to speak. But when you're focused on not making mistakes, you start choosing silence over speaking. The same is true for people who are naturally shy. If you don't enjoy talking to others, or if conversation doesn't come naturally to you, then creating opportunities for output can feel difficult from the very beginning. I have a close friend like this. She's Japanese. She was studying Korean, but she used to say things like, I want to chat with Korean people, but I don't know what to talk about. And I've never been good at texting for a long time. Making small talk or talking on the phone, I just can't do it. So the question is, how can people like these start producing more output? And how can they actually increase those opportunities in a way that actually feels manageable? I'll explain that together with the next reason, main reason 2. So let's move on. Many people believe things like, if I study abroad, I'll be able to speak well. Or if I'm in a romantic relationship, my language skills will improve quickly. And in many cases, that's actually true. But why? The answer is environment. Being in an environment where you use the language regularly and being around people you feel comfortable speaking that language with, this kind of environment is absolutely essential for language learning. Let's take an example. If you're studying Japanese, but out of 24 hours a day, you only spend 1 hour exposed to Japanese, and the rest of your life is lived entirely in another language, then naturally your mind will continue to think and operate almost entirely in your most comfortable language. Staying in an environment where you rarely use your target language makes the learning process much slower, and quite simply, the language doesn't have enough space to grow in your daily life. There is another type of environment you should try to avoid. That is, speaking your target language with people who make you feel tense or uncomfortable. Even in your native language, there are people you feel relaxed with and people you don't. Talking to someone you don't enjoy speaking with is already difficult in your native language. So, doing it in a foreign language raises the difficulty even higher. In those situations, it's not just your language ability, your conversation skills are too, and that creates a very high barrier to output. So, if your personality or your environment is stopping you from increasing your output, I want to share 3 practical solutions. The first one is talking to yourself. This is something many books and teachers recommend. So most of you probably already know about it, but in reality, very few people actually practice it. When you try to put your thoughts into words, you may realize it's harder than you expected. What I personally do is this. When I hear a native speaker uses an expression, I will think, oh, I would like to use that phrase myself, and I quickly write it down in a note or app on my phone. Then I use those expressions when I talk to myself, because I can clearly imagine how a native speaker uses them, but I can use those phrases more naturally with real intention and emotion. Instead of creating sentences from scratch and wondering, is this correct? I recommend collecting expressions from YouTube and real conversations and using them in your self-talk output. The second method is using ChatGPT, language apps, or texting with native speakers. Today, there are many free apps where you can communicate with native speakers, and also AI tools that allow you to practice conversation anytime. Use them as much as possible for output. Personally, I often chat with ChatGPT when I have free time, and I also used apps like HelloTalk to enjoy chatting in my target language. I also had friends who practiced by sending DMs on Instagram and actively creating opportunities to write and respond. The most important thing here is to increase the amount of time you spend thinking and expressing yourself in your target language. The book called Output Taizen suggests that an ideal balance is around 70% of output and 30% of input. The final solution is to practice output and conversation with people you feel relaxed and comfortable with. As I mentioned earlier, speaking a foreign language with someone you already feel awkward with is extremely difficult. This is something I'm very conscious of when I practice output. Personally, I often practice speaking my target language while having a drink with someone. Alcohol naturally helps both people relax, and for me, it makes the fear of making mistakes disappear. I could speak more freely and casually. So finally, if you have your own favorite ways of practicing output, or if you found a routine that works for you, please share it in the comments below. I would love to hear your experiences. But even after working on their mindset and environment, some people still feel stuck. And that's what we'll talk about in main reason 3. Many people watching this video are probably struggling because of this third reason. You might be using the wrong kind of input. Output is absolutely essential if you want to speak, but if you're doing output but still don't feel comfortable speaking, then the problem is usually not the amount of output, it's the quality of your input. In other words, you're doing input but not the kind of input that leads to speaking. This idea is clearly explained in the book Input to Taizen. The author recommends a balance of roughly 70% output and 30% input. What he emphasizes most is the depth of input. For example, instead of reading 10 books in a month, he suggests reading 3 books deeply to the point where you can write about them, explain them to a friend, and actually use what you've learned. So let me ask you this. When you do input, do you have a clear purpose? Imagine there are 2 learners. One learner spends 5 minutes memorizing these 4 words. 話す, 聞く, 読む, 書く. Another learner spends the same 5 minutes focusing only on the word 話す. Also studying example sentences like 私は日本語を話します. 私は日本語を話しました. Which learner do you think will be better able to use the word after 5 minutes? Obviously, the second learner. If the fast approach sounds familiar to you, you're not alone. The key question is this. Are you imagining how you use the language while you're doing input? Now, some of you might be thinking about memorization techniques like spaced repetition. This is actually a very effective method, and I use it myself when learning vocabulary. Instead of spending a long time on one word to memorize, you quickly go through all the words and repeat them again and again. There are even studies showing that watching the same video twice at double speed can help you remember more than watching it once at normal speed. I completely agree with this. When I studied English for exams, I memorized a lot of vocabulary in this way, and it worked very well for reading and listening. But creating sentences in those words or using them in real conversations requires a completely different skill. The real question is not do you know this word, but can you use this word? Memorizing vocabulary directly improves reading and listening, but it does not automatically lead to speaking or writing. When your goal is remembering, your input looks one way, but when your goal is using, your input has to look very different. When I realized this, it was honestly mind-blowing. Input that helps you speak and input that helps you listen and read are not the same. So here's the message I want you to take away from this video. Output is about quantity. Input is about quality. I'll say that again because this is the most important point. Output is about quantity. Input is about quality. Personally, I tend to focus heavily on input, and I believe that without strong listening skills, conversation is extremely difficult. So I spend a lot of time building that foundation first. Once my listening skill reaches a certain level, I gradually increase my output through the methods I mentioned earlier by speaking with native speakers, often in relaxed situations. As a result, my study balance naturally shifts towards 70% of output and 30% of input. But when I'm a beginner, it looks very different. At the stage, it's more like 90% of input and 10% of output, and I slowly increase the output over time. Today we talked about why you can understand a language but still struggle to speak it. The reason is simple. Your output may be limited and your input may be focused on understanding, not on using. While preparing this video, I learned a lot myself. It made me rethink my own language learning habits, and I noticed things I hadn't been aware of before. Everyone learns differently, but if you're frustrated because you can understand but can't speak, try changing your input from input for understanding to input for output. It might completely change the way you study. That's all for today. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up, and also don't forget to hit the subscribe button, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye bye.